Please be seated, everybody. Good morning and happy Easter. Oh, it has been a great morning. Started on the beach this morning, and that beautiful natural church there on the beach, and just tons of folks came out, and just great crowds, and the weather worked, and the clouds were wonderful, and the sun off the clouds was just beautiful, and it was just a great morning. What a great way to begin this day in all that it means to us as people of faith. And then, of course, services here at the church they've just been really affirming and encouraging about who we are and all that we have going on in this place. And today we celebrate that which stands at the very heart of who we are, that which is foundational to our life and faith as people of faith. Today we celebrate our Lord's resurrection. But don't think for a minute that it was an easy job for God to bring people to a place of even acknowledging resurrection. We've sort of had this problem very early on in this gospel story. The problem is what to do with the empty tomb. The empty tomb does not in any way, it may suggest resurrection to us. That's not what it suggested to the people at that time, in that day. In fact, whether you were one of the disciples or religious leaders of that time, there was a lot of suspicion in the air. The questions were being asked about what they had done with his body. And that's coming from both the disciples and the religious leaders on both sides. They're still warring with each other. People aren't sure about what this means. All they know is that someone has taken the body. They're not celebrating resurrection in that moment. In fact, we're told in Luke's gospel today that when Mary Magdalene and the others run back to tell the disciples what they've seen, we're told that they didn't believe them. In fact, we're told the disciples thought it was a tall tale. They just didn't believe it. They couldn't accept it. It didn't make sense when he was alive. When he talked about it before he was put to death. He told them he would rise again. They didn't believe him then. They didn't believe him after the resurrection. When did they believe him? When did resurrection become a reality? When was that? When was the Easter moment? Because it certainly wasn't the empty tomb moment. It was just, empty tomb marks the beginning of the story. But that wasn't the moment. If you look at John's gospel, I think the moment is found when Jesus looks at Mary Magdalene. And these women deserve it. They were there when the men were hiding. Right? But look at what Jesus looks at Mary and says. Jesus turns to Mary and says, finally, in John's gospel, he says, Mary. In a way, and she hadn't even recognized him yet. He just says her name in a way that only he could say it. And in that moment, you see, she acknowledges who he is. That he is alive. That he's alive. That's the Easter moment. That's the moment of resurrection. In Luke's gospel, the gospel we have before us today, in Luke's gospel, what follows is that great story about the miracle on the road to Emmaus. The disciples are running, trying to get out of Dodge, fleeing for their lives, and just like Jesus always does, he's working to catch up with us. He's working to run after us and hopefully catch up with us and grab hold of us and say it's all true, it's real. On that road to Emmaus, he catches up with some of those disciples, and he finally, not in that moment, but in going to Emmaus and breaking bread with them, we're told that they saw him, they recognized him, and their spirits leaped with joy in this place of awareness and awakening, and resurrection hope hit them. Resurrection hope was born into the world. You see, not so much in an empty tomb. It wasn't in a negative. Resurrection hope was born in a positive. God's working to catch up with us and to encounter us somewhere, to catch up with us somewhere. Absent that encounter, there is no resurrection hope. Oh, there is for the world, but not for me. Not for you, not unless there is this moment or moments of awakening and discovery and encounter. Martin Buber writes about this. Martin Buber was a Jewish thinker, a Jewish writer. He was a Jewish mystic, scholar. He was a philosopher. He was a theologian. Martin Buber is a great name in the annals of just good theological reflection. He wrote that great book, I and Thou, which many people will recognize today. But Martin Buber, what really moved me and sort of fit into what I want to talk about today as it relates to his life, as much as Martin Buber knew about God, all of his life he dedicated his life to trying to understand the things of God and try desperately to bring others along into that experience of God. As much as he knew about God, as smart as he was, as intelligent as he was, his ability to think beyond me or you, he was gifted in that way. At his 80th birthday, guess what he said? At his 80th birthday, Martin Buber's birthday, this was in the middle of the 20th century, 1955 or so, I think. Martin Buber said at his 80th birthday, he said, you know what? All of that counts for little. He said, what matters is that somewhere along the way, I saw something. And then I went to the window and I pointed. Is that magical? A man of such brilliance, such theological reflection, was able to say, my life has simply been to have seen something and then gone to the window and pointed. Martin Buber would say that that's what the spiritual life is all about. It is about these moments of awakening. It's about these moments of encounter. It is all about the experience, Buber says. It's all about the experience of God. And he said the great news for him, the good news is that God is always trying desperately to move on my life and yours. The question is whether or not you and I are open to that encounter. Do we expect it? Do we welcome that encounter into our lives? For those who do, they see something, and they go to the window, and they point. So today, I thought, this past week, I really struggled with this sermon because I want to share some things with you today about my own life and faith. This idea came to me a couple weeks ago. I was upstairs doing the Lenten series on Wednesday night, and somebody in the crowd said, Rick, tell us about your experience. Talk some about your encounters with the risen Lord. And in the moment, we didn't have time to go there really, but in the moment I found myself thinking, my God, these people are asking me about something they should have already known. I mean, I realized that part of what this sermon today had to be about was my testimony. Something of my testimony. Because that's the only way for me that I felt like it could begin to challenge you to think about those places, those ways along the way where God came to you and God revealed God's self to you and stirred you up and carried you off to a new place of being. And so for me it began, and there were lots of places along my life in my story, but for me, the first part for me immediately was being around 7 or 8 years old. We're probably somewhere in the mid-60s in that Methodist church in Palatka. And all I remember that Sunday morning was sitting next to my grandfather. He was a teacher. He always came through that door of the Westbury class that he taught for 35 years. And I used to run from Sunday school to try to get there before him. And so I could see him come down through that door on his crutches, walking over to his seat, and he sat down. And all I remember about that particular morning was I remember a commotion in the church. To this day, I really don't remember seeing anything. I just remember a commotion. I remember people moving around. I remember lots of angry voices. Lots of angry voices. I heard yelling. All I remember was being scared. In church that morning, I was scared. And that was the morning that the first African-American family would come into that church. That church, those folks, by the way, most of that church that left that day, that got up to leave, that church is still around, but they don't know why they're around. They don't know where they came from. The folks that go to this other Methodist church there today, they don't know what happened almost 50 years ago in that other Methodist church in Palatka. I know. I remember, because why I remember this moment is because when all that was going on, my grandfather reached over and touched me, and he said, "Don't move. Stay in your seat. Stay in your seat." He had seen something. He'd seen something. I think he also saw something that another man had seen. There was a prophet around that time who would try to share a dream with a country. Oh, we killed him. We always kill the prophets. They don't last long. But I think my grandfather had seen something of the same dream, the same possibility. He had had an encounter that had moved him to go to the window that morning for me and point to something different, to something else. It was about 10 years later, very different kind of story. It was about 10 years later when we were working on, I got this job. I was in college at the University of Florida. I came home one summer to get this job working in the Cross Florida Barge Canal. Remember that great idea? How many of you remember the Cross Florida Barge Canal? What a brilliant idea this was. I still remember Lyndon Johnson coming in on the helicopter that day to talk about how marvelous this was. And of course, it was shut down in months. But during that time, I got a job moving debris out of Lake Ocklawaha. I worked on a tug. Thank God my parents had no idea what I was doing. I mean, they would never have approved of this. But I was working on a tugboat. Our job was to go out there, and we had these claws. There was a winch, and we had these claws, and our job was to get me and this older gentleman. He was an African-American gentleman, probably, I think, about 70 at the time. I fell in love with him. He and I had to get in the water and hook those stumps and those trees up to that claw so we could winch them up out of the Ocklawaha. And I tell you what, the gators were bigger than those trees. That's all I remember. I was scared. You know what? I mean, I was scared. Don't you think I wasn't? But this fella kept telling me, don't worry, I'll get in the way. If one comes, I'll get in the way. And one day, he said to me, he asked me, he said, "You go to church?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't go to church." And he said, and he didn't push or shove. He didn't push or shove. He didn't preach at me. He wasn't ugly about it. He just said, "You know what? Church has always been an important part of my life." And the more I thought about that later, I thought, here's a man who has nothing. And yet he had such joy. He was so happy every day. He so celebrated life. And that somehow in that moment, God was giving me another gift of someone who had seen something and who had gone to the window and pointed. It was the very next year at the University of Florida that I was playing tennis with one of the tennis coaches over there. And after we finished hitting for about an hour, he says, "Well, let's go to a game. Let's go watch the Gator game, the baseball game over there." And I said, "Sure." It was about the 6th or 7th inning that this coach turned to me and said, "So tell me what part of your life, where's God in your life?" And I just went, "Oh, please." I just laughed and said, "Not again." And he said, "What's up?" And I said, "Well, this just keeps happening a lot lately." And he said, "Did you ever think there might be a reason for that?" And he said to me that day, what he said was, he didn't push or shove. He just encouraged me. He shared something of what he'd seen. And he says, "You might give it a chance." He says, "I think it'll help you find some balance in your life between, recreation and study." And he says, "You've really got to find some balance in that essential part of your being, that spiritual part of your life." And he went over to the window that day and pointed to something that would, I think, stay with me. It was 3 years later when I was sitting in that dean's office in that law school. And I worked really hard to get to that place. And I was really excited about being there. And I'd had a great first year in law school. And I went in to see that dean that day, and Dean White, and I said, "Dean," I said, "I'm really struggling." I said, "I love it here. And I said, but I think I'm in the wrong place. Now, you have to know, I'm making it sound like this was kind of matter of fact. I was going through a terribly emotional time. I mean, I was really struggling with my life and where I was supposed to be in my life. And I was getting really tired of God at this time. And I was confused, and I was almost angry that I was confused. And so I remember telling Dean White all of this that morning, and he was very patient. And then he said to me something I'll never forget. He said, Rick, I've got 4 kids your age. And if any one of them came into me and said they were thinking about ministry, I would be a very proud man. And in that moment, that law school dean gave me a glimpse of something he'd seen in his life, and it would change my life forever, along with all the others. Along with all the others, I've shared a few, but there were so many others along the way. And Martin Buber would say that those kinds of encounters and experiences are available to all of us every day. The question is whether or not we are open to them. Do we welcome such encounters? Do we welcome such experiences? This is a God who's trying desperately to catch up with us and to raise us up with Him into new life, into dynamic, bold, and abundant living, a richness of life that you and I can only dream about. And so today, I hope that maybe all of us have been moved to think a little bit about what we have seen. Have you seen something? But it's not enough just to have seen something. Have you found the courage to be that encounter for somebody else? That's what I was thankful for. I was thankful for all those people along the way who found the courage in those awkward moments to say something about what they had seen. And now today I stand before you filled with a hope that I've done well with what God's entrusted to me, but also horrified at the number of times that perhaps I failed to be the same for somebody else. Failed to help them to realize their potential in life and faith. You see, it's not enough for us just to see something somebody else has seen. It's mine and yours to see something of the same and then become that encounter for someone else. To be that one that can maybe gently push or shove someone off into a new place, a new disposition, a new attitude, a new perspective, new priorities on life and living. Look, without my witness and yours, it's still just an empty tomb. It's just an empty tomb. It's the encounter that makes the difference. Open your life to the encounter. It's real. It will change your life forever. And you don't have to become preachers. Isn't that great news? I got news for you. It's great news. You don't have to be a preacher, but you've got a story to tell. You've got a witness to share. Get over to the window and point to something that you've seen. Amen.